if it goes most everywhere, how can we minimize the damage? So there's a number of considerations there. The first standard one is don't overload the medical system, spread it out over time. And that means some degree of lockdown, but not nearly as much as if you're trying to squash and contain this thing. But people do overestimate the value of medicine, so that's a bit much. What else can we do? We could make sure that the young were the ones initially exposed more than the old, because they have much lower death rate from this. So we need to get to some level of herd immunity, which might be, some roughly half the population. But why not have it be the young half, the healthy half, rather than the old and sick half? And that's also capable of dramatically reducing the death rate. And then we could try to make sure that people were deliberately infected just so we can control when and where it happened. So most of the lockdown is to prevent a tiny fraction of us from infecting others, the tiny fraction who are at the moment infected. But since we don't know who's who, we're locking down everybody. If you deliberately infected some people at a controlled location and time, then you could isolate them there and use your isolation resources far more effectively. And it also allows you to spread out the medical resources over time. You can choose to, say, do it earlier than the peak or later than the peak, right? So just the idea of deliberate infection, if we're going to mostly all get exposed, has those substantial advantages. Get the young and healthy and get the control of the isolation resource. But in addition to these advantages, there's apparently a prospect, a very likely prospect, that there are big advantages in how someone's infected. So for most viruses we know, there is a dose effect. That is, the initial dose that you get of the virus matters a lot. So for example, if there's a droplet in the air, how many viruses are in that droplet? Or how many droplets do you breathe in the first few minutes where you're getting infected? If it's a tiny droplet with very few viruses, that's a low dose. You touch a door knob an hour after somebody else touched it, then that might also be a low dose. But if you get infected, say at home, by kissing your infected spouse, you're going to get a big dose. And we have a lot of data on other diseases that show low doses can have much lower morbidity and mortality, i.e. you get hurt a lot less. And in fact, before we had vaccines, we were using variolation in particular for smallpox. So for example, in the United States, during the Revolutionary War, US troops in Canada were hit by smallpox and devastated. And that's why basically Canada is a separate country, because those troops couldn't fight the war there. George Washington was worried about this. And even though Continental Congress had outlawed variolation, intentional infection with low doses, he ordered it for the US troops anyway, in secret, so that the enemy wouldn't attack while they were sick. And basically this reduced the death rate from smallpox from 20 to 30% down to 1 to 2%. And that allowed us to win the Revolutionary War.
Is the worry that if we did this, there's too much societal pressure, or like the headlines of, hey, the way to solve this is to actually intentionally infect people with low dosage, and we just can't as a society, even if the science shows that it's effective, we can't get there because there's so much fear and uncertainty in kind of the press? Or do you feel like it's actually viable that we could do this?
So there's a difference between we all deciding to do it together as a joint policy enforced, and some of us deciding to do it because we want to. So there are many problems with the pandemic that we need to do everything together. There are collective problems, but this isn't one of them. If we have a low dose way to get infected and we allow some people to get infected that way, that helps. And we don't have to require them or even agree together that we should, we just have to allow it. So, and in fact, people are in a sense allowed to get infected, but the problem is the people who would supply the infection aren't allowed to supply it because of regulations of drugs and medical ethics experiments. So actually the current limitation is that we would just need 100 or so people to just do a small trial, and we can't get medical ethics approval to do those small experiments because the people who run ethics experiments say this is unethical, because in their calculation, the benefit to society of finding a way to lower our death rate by a factor of 10, it doesn't count. The only thing that counts is these people might, by getting infected, get sick and get hurt. And that's just the rule.
But in that trial, those people would be opting into this, right? This would not, like, to your point,
but that's still not allowed. So medical ethics calculations say we're not allowed to let people volunteer. Now, of course, that's against our practice in the military and for firefighters and police. There's lots of people in our society who we allow to take risks for us and we pay them. But the medical ethics interpretation is that's not to be allowed to people who take medical experiments. That's just their decision of what ethics is, and they are not budging in this crisis.
I mean, that sounds pretty ridiculous, right? I'm immediately thinking of, I saw a video online in a prison where prisoners were basically gathered in a circle, and what it was being described, and of course we don't know with 100% certainty, but what was being described in the video is that they were, one of them was positive for coronavirus, and they were actually trying to infect each other so that they could get out. Right, which sounds pretty ridiculous, but basically what you're talking about is a much more medically driven or scientific driven version of that in a low dose manner.
Right. So the key problem with people just getting infected in that way, first is they're not getting a low dose or trying to make sure that they're getting a low effect, but also they're not being isolated and preventing it from spreading. So what I recommend is something that I call a hero hotel. You go there, you pay to go there, and then they immediately infect you and keep you there until you're recovered. And so you're not inflaming the whole pandemic. You are just getting this treatment and getting past it. Now, people may well want to do that for many reasons. So not just wanting to help society to get us all past this, but they themselves could get back to work afterwards and get back to socializing and get back to their lives. And, many people are really quite frustrated at being locked down. So I've heard many people say informally that they sure wish they could find a way to just get past this and they'd be willing to take some risks. But what we'd like to do is to have them have a much lower risk by doing it deliberately. And all we need is some small trials. And see, unfortunately, the problem is if people can sit in a circle with an infected person and try to get them, that's legally allowed, but we are not legally allowing doctors, say, to do something like this because the treatment hasn't been medically approved. And as a company, you couldn't sell people something that let them be infected with a low dose because that hasn't been approved by regulators. And so we're in this sad situation where you'd legally be allowed to do the worst thing, but not the better things because, we're holding basically these companies and professionals to much higher standards than we hold individuals.